The child's voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. Please, you have to look under your bikes. 8 years old, trembling against Canyon's Edge Diner's sun-bleached wall. Caleb Rivers faced 12 men the entire town feared. Iron Forge MC bikers. Redstone had called criminals for 15 years. But that morning behind Morrison's Hardware, where his mother worked, Caleb had heard something that turned his blood to ice. Sheriff Daniel Cross, the town's hero, planting drugs beneath their motorcycles. A trap, a frame, a lie disguised as justice. Now those men walked toward their bikes completely unaware. Behind them, police sirens screamed closer. Caleb had seconds to decide stay silent and safe or speak truth and risk everything. His next words would shatter a town's illusions forever. The Arizona sun beat down on Redstone's cracked asphalt with the kind of intensity that made the air shimmer and dance. It was just past noon on a Saturday in late June, and the temperature had already climbed to 102 degrees. Canyon's Edge Diner sat on the outskirts of town, a modest establishment with faded red paint and a flickering neon sign that had been promising the best coffee in Arizona since 1907. The building had seen better days, its parking lot a patchwork of repairs that never quite matched, but it remained a fixture in the community, where locals gathered for breakfast and gossip in equal measure. Caleb pressed himself against the rough brick wall, his small frame shaking despite the oppressive heat. His worn sneakers scraped against gravel as he tried to make himself invisible, but his eyes remained fixed on the row of motorcycles parked in formation near the entrance. Chrome gleamed under the merciless sun, and the distinctive rumble of Harley-Davidson engines had only just faded, leaving an echo that seemed to vibrate in his chest. The boy's face was pale beneath a constellation of freckles, and his sandy hair stuck to his forehead with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. His hands shook as he clutched a battered backpack to his chest, and his breathing came in short, panicked gasps. Through the diner's plate glass window, Caleb could see them. 12 men in leather vests adorned with patches that proclaimed their allegiance to the Iron Forge Motorcycle Club, a chapter that had called Redstone home for the past 15 years. Their vests bore a distinctive anvil and flame insignia, and across their backs, the words that made most people in town cross the street or lock their car doors: Iron Forge, MC Redstone. Chapter. The leader sat at the head of two pushed-together tables, a man in his mid-40s with steel-gray hair, pulled back in a ponytail and a face weathered by years of desert riding. His name was Marcus Bennett, though everyone called him Hammer, and he commanded respect not through violence, but through an ironclad sense of loyalty and a reputation for keeping his word. Around him sat his brother's men with road names like Diesel Wrench and Smoke, each with their own story etched in scars and ink. They looked so normal, sharing plates of fries and cups of coffee like anyone else. The sight made what Caleb had to do even more terrifying, because it meant acknowledging that the monsters under the bed might actually be more complicated than the story suggested. 3 months ago, Caleb's world had tilted on its axis in ways he hadn't fully understood until this moment. His mother's car had broken down on Highway 89 during a flash flood rain, coming down in sheets that turned the desert into a temporary river. They'd been stranded, cell phone dead, with water rising around the tires, and Caleb terrified in the back seat, watching his mother's hands shake on the steering wheel. Then a motorcycle had appeared through the downpour, and a massive man with a beard that reached his chest had pulled over without hesitation. Jackson Stone called Diesel for reasons that became obvious when you heard his voice had spent 2 hours in the pouring rain getting their engine started again. His hands were gentle, despite their size, methodical, as he worked through the problem while water streamed down his leather vest. When Rachel finally tried to press a $20 bill into his grease-stained hands, he'd refused with words that Caleb would never forget. "Just pay it forward, ma'am. That's all any of us can do." Rachel had cried the whole way home, not from fear, but from shame at her own prejudice. She'd spent 15 years crossing the street to avoid these men, believing every story the town told about them, never once questioning whether appearance matched reality. That memory flickered in Caleb's mind now as he watched Diesel throw his head back in laughter at something another member had said, and the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on his chest like a physical thing. Caleb lived in a 2-bedroom apartment above Morrison's Hardware, where his mother worked full-time managing inventory and customer service. The space was small but clean, filled with the smell of wood and metal that drifted up through the floorboards. His father had left when Caleb was 3, disappearing one morning with no explanation and no forwarding address. No child support ever came, no birthday cards, no acknowledgement that Caleb existed at all. Rachel worked 50 hours a week to keep them fed and housed. And Caleb had learned early to be responsible to do his homework without being asked to keep the apartment tidy, to make simple meals when his mother worked late. School was its own kind of battlefield. Copper Ridge Elementary was where the town's children learned not just reading and math, but also the social hierarchy that would follow them into adulthood. Caleb was poor, and kids his age had a cruel way of noticing these things. His clothes came from the thrift store on Main Street. His backpack was 4 years old, held together with duct tape. He lived above a hardware store instead of in one of the nice houses on the hill. The other children called him weird for being quiet, for preferring to observe rather than participate, for finding comfort in building things with his hands rather than playing sports at recess. Tommy Pierce was his only real friend, a kid whose family wasn't wealthy either, and who didn't care that Caleb's sneakers had holes in them. They spent lunch periods together talking about nature documentaries and building model cars from kits they bought with allowance money saved over months. It was Tommy who taught Caleb that friendship meant accepting people as they were, rather than judging them for what they lacked. The Iron Forge MC had arrived in Redstone 15 years ago, purchasing property in the industrial district, where rent was cheap and neighbors scarce. The 12 core members ranged in age from their late 30s to late 50s, led by Marcus Bennett, who'd come back from Iraq with medals and trauma, and a need for brotherhood that the regular world couldn't provide. They'd opened a legitimate motorcycle repair shop, paid their taxes, followed the law with meticulous care. But none of it mattered because they wore leather vests with patches that frightened people who'd never bothered to look beyond surface appearances. The town's response had been immediate and unforgiving. Parents warned children to stay away from the industrial district. Store owners watched the bikers carefully when they entered establishments, hands hovering near panic buttons that were never actually needed. Sheriff Daniel Cross had led the crusade against them from the beginning, making it his personal mission to rid Redstone of what he called the motorcycle menace. Police cruised by the clubhouse more frequently than anywhere else in town. Members were pulled over for minor infractions that other citizens would receive warnings for. Applications for permits and licenses faced unusual delays and scrutiny. For 15 years, the Iron Forge MC had endured this treatment without significant complaint. They volunteered at the animal shelter. They taught motorcycle safety courses to teenagers for free. They donated to community causes. But the town had decided who they were before ever giving them a chance to prove otherwise. And changing minds that had calcified over a decade and a half required more than good deeds and clean records. That Saturday morning, Caleb had arrived at the hardware store early to help his mother with inventory. Summer meant he spent most days there watching customers from the window, learning about tools and materials, making himself useful in ways that eased his mother's burden. Around 9:30, he'd taken out the trash to the dumpsters behind the building, walking through the loading dock area where deliveries arrived and old pallets were stacked for disposal. That's when he heard the voices. Sheriff Cross's distinctive baritone carried across the space with authority that came from 20 years wearing a badge. Caleb's instinct had been to call out to announce his presence, but something in the sheriff's tone made him freeze instead. He ducked behind a stack of pallets, heart already beginning to race, knowing without understanding why, that he was about to witness something he shouldn't. The conversation that followed would replay in Caleb's mind for the rest of his life, with perfect clarity, every word etched into memory like words carved in stone. Sheriff Cross was speaking to Deputy Luis Martinez, a young officer who'd only been with the department for 2 years. The sheriff carried a duffel bag that clinked with each movement, and when he set it down on the loading dock, Caleb could see clear plastic bags through the partially open zipper. Cross's voice was matter-of-fact, almost casual, as though he were discussing routine police work, rather than something that made Caleb's stomach turn. Iron Forge meets at Canyon's Edge every Saturday noon. Regular as clockwork. Predictable bastards make this almost too easy. Martinez's response came hesitant, uncertain. Sheriff, are you sure about this planting evidence? That's not... there are procedures. The sheriff's interruption was sharp-cutting. Don't question me, Martinez. I've been cleaning up this town for 20 years while you were still in high school. Those bikers are a cancer. Time for surgery. The sound of plastic bags being handled, zippers opening and closing, made Caleb's hands clench into fists. He wanted desperately to run to unsee what he was witnessing, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Cross continued speaking, his voice carrying the kind of self-righteousness that came from someone who'd convinced himself that breaking the law was justified if it served a greater purpose. Evidence bags from the Rodriguez bust last month. Meth cocaine enough to put all 12 of them away for decades. Federal charges, mandatory minimums, the whole 9 yards. Martinez's protest was weak, barely audible. But they're not actually criminals. We've never been able to prove. Cross's response was immediate and cold. They're criminals because I say they are. When you wear a badge long enough, you learn that justice and law aren't always the same thing. Sometimes you have to make justice happen. Those men don't belong here. They scare good people. They corrupt our youth with their lifestyle. If I have to bend a few rules to protect this community, that's a price I'm willing to pay. Caleb pressed himself tighter against the pallets, trying to control his breathing, terrified that any sound would reveal his presence. The sheriff's footsteps moved away toward where vehicles were parked behind the building. Martinez followed reluctantly, his voice carrying doubt that Cross clearly had no patience for. Caleb waited until their voices faded completely, before moving, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and fear that felt like it might consume him entirely. The next hour passed in a fog of indecision and terror. Caleb went through the motions of helping with inventory, his mother noticing something was wrong, but attributing it to the heat or tiredness. His mind raced through options, none of them good. He could tell his mother, but she would immediately call the police, and the police worked for Sheriff Cross. He could try to report it anonymously, but who would believe an 8-year-old over the town's respected sheriff? He could stay silent, stay safe, protect himself from consequences he couldn't even imagine. But silence meant 12 innocent men would go to prison for crimes they didn't commit. Silence meant allowing corruption to win because speaking up required more courage than Caleb knew he possessed. Every instinct screamed at him to forget what he'd heard, to pretend he'd never been behind that loading dock, to go back to his small life and let adults handle adult problems. Yet Diesel's face kept appearing in his mind. The big man kneeling in the rain, fixing their car with patient hands, refusing payment because helping people was its own reward. Rachel's tears of shame on the drive home, her whispered admission that she'd been wrong to judge based on appearance. Tommy's friendship teaching him that people were complicated, that surface judgments missed the complexity underneath. Around 11:45, Caleb made his decision. He told his mother he was going to get lunch at the diner, which wasn't unusual. She gave him $10 in instructions to be back by 2 for the afternoon shift. He walked out of the hardware store with his backpack containing nothing but a water bottle and the weight of knowledge that felt heavier than anything physical could ever be. The walk to Canyon's Edge took 12 minutes, long enough for Caleb to question his decision with every step. The temperature was climbing toward its daily peak heat, radiating off asphalt in visible waves. Most people were indoors, seeking air conditioning and shade. The streets felt empty, abandoned, like a ghost town in one of the westerns his mother watched on Sunday afternoons. When the diner came into view, Caleb could see the motorcycles already parked in their neat formation. 12 Harleys, chrome gleaming leather seats, baking in the sun. Through the window, he could see the bikers inside, and the sight made his feet slow to a crawl. These were the men the entire town feared, the ones parents used as cautionary tales, the ones Sheriff Cross had decided were too dangerous to exist in his perfect vision of Redstone. Caleb stood across the street for 10 minutes, frozen by terror that felt like it might split him in two. His hands shook so badly he had to shove them in his pockets. His breathing came fast in shallow panic, rising in his throat like bile. He could still turn back, could still choose safety over truth, could still be just a kid worried about homework and soccer, rather than whatever this moment would transform him into. But thinking of Gabriel Santos, a man he'd never met, but whose cousin Elena worked at the school cafeteria, changed something. Elena had cried in the parking lot 6 months ago, telling anyone who would listen that her cousin was innocent, that Sheriff Cross had framed him, that nobody would believe a Hispanic man with tattoos over a respected lawman. Caleb had overheard and thought little of it at the time, but now those words took on new meaning. How many others had there been? How many innocent people had Cross destroyed while the town looked away? The diner's bell jangled as Caleb pushed through the door, the sound seeming impossibly loud in his ears. Conversation dimmed immediately as heads turned toward the entrance. He felt 12 pairs of eyes land on him, assessing, questioning why a child had walked into their space unaccompanied. His mouth went dry, words he'd practiced disappearing from memory like water evaporating in the desert heat. Betty Walsh, a waitress who had worked at Canyon's Edge for 30 years, was the first to speak, her voice carrying concern rather than hostility. "Honey, are you lost? Where's your mama?" Caleb's voice came out as barely a whisper, so quiet he had to repeat himself. "I need to talk to them." He pointed at the biker's table with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. The youngest member, a man in his late 30s with full-sleeve tattoos and sharp eyes, leaned forward with suspicion, born from years of unwelcome attention. "Kid, you lost." His hand moved instinctively toward his vest, not reaching for a weapon, but positioning himself defensively, a habit developed through constant harassment. Marcus Bennett stood slowly, his chair scraping against linoleum with a sound that made Caleb flinch. The president of the Iron Forge MC was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded attention without requiring aggression. He walked toward Caleb with measured steps, then crouched down to eye level in a gesture that was clearly meant to be non-threatening. His voice when he spoke was careful, neutral, seeking to understand rather than intimidate. "What's your name, son?" Caleb forced the words out past the terror clogging his throat. Caleb Rivers. My mom, you helped her with the car. In the rain." Recognition flickered across Diesel's face immediately. The massive man with the chest-length beard nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I remember your mama. She doing okay?" The genuine concern in Diesel's voice, the human kindness that contradicted everything the town said about these men, gave Caleb the courage to push past his fear and deliver the warning that could save or destroy them all. "She's fine, but you're not. None of you are. You have to look under your bikes, please." The atmosphere in the diner changed instantly, shifting from curiosity to alert tension in the space between heartbeats. Hands that had been relaxed on coffee cups now tensed. Eyes that had been casually watchful turned sharp and assessing. Years of harassment and false accusations had trained these men to recognize threats, and Caleb's words set off every alarm they'd learned to heed. Marcus's eyes sharpened, steel gray locking onto Caleb's face with intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. "What did you say?" Caleb felt tears forming, but forced them back through sheer will, his voice cracking with urgency. "Please, please look under your bikes. There's something there." "Something bad. I heard them talking this morning. Sheriff Cross and Deputy Martinez. Behind the hardware store where my mom works." His words came faster now, tumbling over each other in desperate rush to be believed. "They had bags, evidence bags with drugs. They said Iron Forge was cancer. Said it was time for surgery." Those were his exact words. "They planted drugs under your motorcycles. And the police are coming. They're going to arrest you for things you didn't do." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped moving, frozen in doorways, with spatulas and plates suspended in midair. Betty's coffee pot trembled in her hands, sending a thin stream onto the floor, with a sound like rainfall that nobody noticed. Marcus remained crouched beside Caleb, his expression unreadable, as he processed information that should have sounded insane but rang with the terrible clarity of truth. He'd been waiting for this, Caleb realized. Not this specific frame-up, but something. After 15 years of harassment, the bikers had known Cross would eventually find a way to eliminate them permanently. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the afternoon heat. Police cruisers, at least 3 of them, were pulling into the parking lot with lights flashing, an urgency that suggested they expected resistance. Through the window, Caleb could see uniformed officers emerging, hands resting on holsters, their attention fixed on the row of motorcycles that gleamed innocently in the brutal sunlight. And behind them, stepping out of a black sedan, with a smile that made Caleb's blood run cold, was Sheriff Daniel Cross, the man who'd sworn to protect and serve, but who'd decided that protection meant eliminating anyone who didn't fit his narrow vision of community. He wore his uniform with the confidence of someone who'd operated above the law for so long that he'd forgotten laws applied to him at all. Marcus followed Caleb's gaze, and understanding dawned on his face like slow sunrise, terrible and inevitable. "So, that's how it's going to be." The diner door burst open with force that made the bell jangle violently. Sheriff Cross strode in with the bearing of a man who believed he was about to solve all of Redstone's problems in one decisive action. His uniform was immaculate, despite the heat his badge gleaming, and his expression carried grim satisfaction that suggested he'd been planning this moment for a very long time. His voice filled the space with false authority, a performance for the witnesses he knew would validate his version of events. Marcus Bennett, I have a warrant to search your vehicles based on a credible tip about illegal substances. Need you and your boys to step outside hands where we can see them. For a long moment, nobody moved. The 12 bikers sat frozen, calculating odds and outcomes with the speed of people who'd survived by making split-second decisions under pressure. Caleb stood between them and the sheriff, a small barrier of trembling flesh and bone, and Marcus remained crouched beside the boy, one hand resting gently on Caleb's shoulder in a gesture that could have been threatening, but somehow felt protective. Marcus's response came quiet, but carrying an undertone that made even Sheriff Cross pause. Before we do that, I think you should know something. This young man just saved our lives. Or tried to. He came in here terrified out of his mind to warn us that someone planted something under our motorcycles. Now, why would an 8-year-old boy risk approaching a group of men that the whole town has taught him to fear, unless he knew for certain that we were in danger? Cross's face cycled through colors like a broken traffic light, pale then red, then pale again. His hand moved toward his service weapon with unconscious threat, but the presence of witnesses and Betty Walsh's phone now clearly recording made him reconsider the boy is mistaken or lying to protect criminals. Caleb's voice surprised everyone by being steady and clear, cutting through the tension with childish certainty that carried more weight than any adult protestation could have. I'm not lying, sir. I saw you this morning, behind Morrison's Hardware. You and Deputy Martinez. You had, evidence bags with white stuff inside. You said Iron Forge was cancer, said it was time for surgery. Those were your exact words. I heard everything. The silence that followed was absolute profound, the kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes or tornadoes. Even Betty's coffee pot had stopped its trembling drip. The cook stood in the kitchen doorway with spatula forgotten in his hand. Other diners sat frozen with forks suspended halfway to mouths, understanding that they were witnessing something that would reshape their town's history. Sheriff Cross's hand moved back toward his weapon, and in that moment Caleb saw the man's face transform into something ugly and desperate, the mask of authority slipping to reveal naked panic underneath. But before anything could escalate, Marcus moved with surprising speed for a man his size. He swept Caleb behind him, placing his body between the boy and the sheriff, while simultaneously holding up both hands in a gesture of peace. His voice carried the weight of command earned through years of leading men who'd followed him into places where following could mean death. Now hold on, nobody needs to do anything stupid. Sheriff, I'm going to make you an offer. Let's all walk outside together. You, me, your deputies, and every person in this diner who wants to witness what happens next. We'll look under those motorcycles together in broad daylight with plenty of witnesses. Whatever we find, we deal with it right here, right now, in front of God and everybody. Cross's jaw clenched with the tension of a man trapped between equally terrible options. I don't negotiate with criminals. Marcus's response was calm, relentless, the voice of someone who'd found moral high ground and had no intention of surrendering it. Then you have nothing to worry about. If we're criminals with drugs under our bikes, you'll find them, arrest us, and be the hero this town thinks you are. But if that boy is telling the truth, and I think we both know he is, then you've got a much bigger problem than a motorcycle club. The moment stretched like taffy pulled thin and transparent. Caleb could feel his heart beating in his throat, could taste copper fear on his tongue, could sense that everything in his life had led to this single point where truth and power collided and one would have to yield. Sheriff Cross was staring at him with hatred so pure it felt like physical force, and Caleb understood with terrible clarity that speaking up had made him an enemy of someone who believed himself beyond accountability. Finally, Cross nodded stiffly, his voice trying for confidence, but cracking at the edges. Fine, we'll do this your way. But when I find what I know is there, you're all going away for a very long time. They filed out into the brutal afternoon sun, a strange procession of bikers, police officers, diner patrons, and one small boy who had somehow become the fulcrum upon which the entire town's future balanced. The motorcycles gleamed innocently in their neat chrome and leather, and the promise of open roads machines that represented freedom to some and threat to others, depending on who was looking and what they'd been taught to see. Marcus approached his bike first, a vintage 1987 Harley Softail that he'd rebuilt from the frame up over 3 years. He knelt slowly, making sure everyone could see his movements, demonstrating transparency that he knew might be his only protection. His face went very still as he looked underneath, expression shifting from cautious hope to something that looked like vindication mixed with rage. His voice when he spoke was quiet, controlled. "Someone want to hand me a phone with a camera. I think everybody's going to want to see this." Diesel moved first, his massive frame surprisingly nimble as he dropped to one knee beside Marcus. The big man's face, usually set in an expression of casual indifference, tightened with anger that years of discipline kept barely contained. He pulled out his own phone, fingers surprisingly delicate on the screen as he activated the camera and aimed it under Marcus's Harley. What the camera revealed made several people in the crowd gasp audibly. There, secured with industrial zip ties to the frame, were 3 clear plastic bags. Each contained approximately 2 pounds of white crystalline powder. But what made the revelation undeniable was what else the camera captured: a small GPS tracker, still blinking with a tiny red light, and printed clearly on each bag, visible even through the plastic, an evidence tag number from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department. Someone in the crowd whispered with horror and fascination, "Those are evidence bags, official evidence bags." Sheriff Cross's face had gone from red to a sickly gray, the color of someone realizing that years of careful planning had just collapsed into ruins. "That's impossible. Someone must have stolen them from evidence, planted them to frame." Marcus stood, cutting off the sheriff's desperate explanation with a gesture. "Frame who exactly? Sheriff, frame you." He moved methodically down the line of motorcycles, checking under each one, with the careful attention of a man who knew his life depended on what he found. Every bike contained the same setup: 3 bags, GPS trackers, official evidence tags. 12 motorcycles systematically compromised with professional precision that spoke to planning and resources. Marcus's voice carried controlled fury as he addressed the crowd now gathering. "Those evidence tags are numbered. They can be tracked. Every bag logged out of evidence has a paper trail, signature, timestamp, chain of custody. And I'm willing to bet that when Internal Affairs pulls those records, they're going to find your name all over them, Sheriff Cross." Deputy Martinez had gone pale, his hands shaking as he pulled out his own phone and began photographing the scene. The young officer's voice cracked with recognition that his career and possibly his freedom hung in the balance. "Sheriff, I think we need to call state police right now." Cross's composure was cracking like a windshield after a stone strike, spiderweb fractures spreading from a central point of impact. "You'll do no such thing. I am the ranking law enforcement officer in this county, and I am ordering you to—" Marcus interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that could cut steel. "To what? Help you cover up a frame job? Be complicit in planting evidence on innocent citizens, because that's what we are, Sheriff. Innocent, every single one of us." He took a step toward Cross, and despite being 3 inches shorter and 20 pounds lighter, somehow Marcus seemed to tower over the sheriff. "We ride motorcycles and wear patches that make people uncomfortable. But we're taxpayers. We're veterans. Diesel over there did 2 tours in Afghanistan. Wrench volunteers at the animal shelter every weekend. Smoke teaches motorcycle safety courses to teenagers for free." He took another step forward. "We're the people you swore an oath to protect. And instead you decided we were too different, too scary, too outside your comfortable little box to deserve that protection. You decided to destroy us rather than live alongside us." Betty Walsh pushed forward from the crowd, her phone still recording, her voice carrying 3 decades of knowing the sheriff and believing she understood who he was. "I've known you for 20 years, Daniel Cross. Your mama and I were in the same book club. I watched you grow up, saw you become a deputy, celebrated when you made sheriff. And I'm telling you right now in front of everyone that you've shamed your badge and shamed this town." Other voices began to join hers, a chorus of witnesses who'd spent 15 years avoiding the bikers based on assumptions that were dissolving in real time. Mr. Harrison from the hardware store pushed through. I've never had a problem with these boys. They pay cash, they're polite, they don't cause trouble. A woman Caleb didn't recognize added her voice. They donated $5,000 to the library literacy program last Christmas. Anonymous donation, but everyone knew it was them. The tide was turning in ways Sheriff Cross clearly hadn't anticipated. People who had crossed the street to avoid the bikers were now forming a protective semicircle around them. Phones were recording from every angle. The truth was being documented in real time, and there would be no way to bury it, no way to spin it, no way to maintain the narrative that had sustained Cross's corruption for however long it had been operating. Cross's hand moved toward his service weapon again, and this time Deputy Martinez stepped between him and Marcus with a firmness that suggested the young officer had finally found his spine. Don't, sir. Don't make this worse than it already is, please. For a moment, Caleb thought the sheriff might actually draw his weapon. The desperation in Cross's eyes was the look of a cornered animal, something wild and unpredictable that made everyone in the crowd take an unconscious step backward. But then the sound of more sirens cut through the tension, different from the local police cruisers. 3 state police vehicles were approaching, called by someone in the crowd whose voice of reason had cut through the chaos. The next hour passed in a blur of official statements, evidence collection, and the slow, methodical dismantling of a corrupt officer's career. State Police Detective Sarah Klein arrived with the bearing of someone who'd seen enough corruption in her 18 years to know exactly what she was looking at. She brought crime scene technicians who carefully removed and cataloged every bag from under every motorcycle. They photographed the evidence tags, documented the GPS trackers, and took statements from everyone present. Caleb told his story 3 times, once to a state trooper whose kindness made him cry, once to Detective Klein, whose sharp questions made sure every detail was captured, and finally to a woman from Victim Services who wanted to make sure he understood he'd done nothing wrong. Each time his mother held his hand, having arrived running from the hardware store when someone had called her, and each time Marcus and his brother sat nearby, a silent wall of leather and chrome that somehow made him feel safer rather than afraid. Deputy Martinez provided the final piece of evidence when he admitted to Detective Klein that Sheriff Cross had been forcing him to participate in evidence planting for the past 6 months. The young officer's voice shook as he gave his statement, but he held nothing back. He said some people didn't deserve due process, said the system was too slow, too concerned with rights of criminals, said we had to protect Redstone by any means necessary. I should have reported it sooner. I knew it was wrong, I was scared. Sheriff Daniel Cross was arrested in the parking lot of Canyon's Edge Diner, handcuffed in front of the town he'd sworn to protect rights, read in a voice that carried across the gathered crowd. The charges Detective Klein rattled off sounded almost anticlimactic given the magnitude of what had been exposed: evidence tampering, abuse of power, under color of law conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice. Federal charges would be filed later. Klein explained once they determined the full scope of his corruption. As Cross was led to a state police cruiser, he turned back to look at the crowd, at Marcus, at Caleb. His face had gone blank with shock, but his words carried venom. You think this is over? You think one kid's word changes anything? I've been protecting this town for 20 years. When criminals walk free because of him, remember that. Remember you chose chaos over order. Detective Klein pulled Caleb aside before she left, crouching down to his level with an expression that mixed professional pride with human concern. What you did took more courage than most adults have in their entire lives. You might have saved innocent people from prison. That matters. That really matters. But as the state police cruisers departed with Cross in custody, as the crowd began to disperse, as reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the story started arriving with cameras and microphones, Caleb felt something cold settling into his bones. He'd done the right thing, he knew that intellectually, but right didn't feel triumphant or satisfying. It felt terrifying and enormous, and like he'd set something in motion that he couldn't control or predict. Rachel held him tight as they walked home, her arms wrapped around him so firmly he could barely breathe. But he didn't complain. Marcus walked with them, his presence a shield against reporters trying to get comments, his voice firm when he told them that an 8-year-old had been through enough for one day and deserved to be left alone. At the apartment door, Marcus knelt down one more time, pulling something from his pocket. A leather bracelet, simple but well made, with a small silver charm shaped like a motorcycle. This belonged to my wife. She died 6 years ago. Cancer took her before I was ready to let her go. His voice was rough with old grief. She believed in standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying. You reminded me of her today. Keep this. Remember that truth is worth the pain. Caleb took the bracelet with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, his voice barely audible. What happens now, to you, to the sheriff, to everyone? Marcus's honesty was perhaps the kindest thing he could have offered. I don't know, but we'll face it together. You're under our protection now. Understand? Anyone comes at you for this, they come through all of us. That evening, Caleb sat on his bed, unable to eat the dinner his mother had made, unable to focus on the television she'd turned on to distract him, unable to stop replaying the moment he'd walked into that diner, knowing his life would never be the same. He'd saved 12 innocent men from prison. He'd exposed corruption that had probably hurt many others. He'd done what every lesson about citizenship and morality said he should do. So why did he feel like he'd painted a target on his back that would never wash off? Rachel sat beside him, holding his hand, her own fear barely concealed beneath false comfort. You were so brave today, baby. But I'm scared now. Scared of what comes next. Sheriff Cross has friends. People who won't like what you exposed. The apartment felt smaller somehow. The walls thinner, the door less secure. Through the window, Caleb could see the street below where a motorcycle was parked, tank from the Iron Forge keeping watch, protecting them from threats Caleb couldn't name, but could feel gathering in the darkness like storm clouds on the horizon. At 11 that night, the phone rang with shrill urgency that made both Caleb and Rachel jump. She answered it with trembling hands, and Caleb watched her face go white as she listened to whoever was on the other end. Her voice when she spoke carried terror she couldn't hide. He's 8 years old. You leave him alone. She slammed the phone down, then immediately picked it up again to call the police, then remembered with terrible clarity that the police were part of the problem. Detective Klein had given them her direct number for exactly this reason, and Rachel used it now with hands that shook so badly she could barely dial. Caleb lay back on his bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of consequences settling over him like a shroud. Someone had just threatened him. Sheriff Cross was in jail, which meant someone else was making threats. Someone who'd been working with Cross or benefiting from his corruption or had their own reasons to want Caleb silenced. The scope of what he'd exposed was bigger than one corrupt sheriff, and that realization made his chest tight with fear that tasted like metal. Marcus arrived within 20 minutes of Rachel's call to Klein, bringing Diesel and 2 other members. They set up a rotation outside the apartment, visible deterrent to whoever had made that threatening phone call. But deterrence only worked if threats were rational, and Caleb was learning that people cornered by truth sometimes became irrational in ways that were terrifying to contemplate. As he finally drifted toward uneasy sleep, the leather bracelet tight around his wrist, Caleb's last conscious thought was a question that would haunt him through everything that followed. How deep did Sheriff Cross's corruption go, and how many people had reason to want the boy who exposed it permanently silenced? Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the desert landscape look like it belonged on a postcard rather than in Caleb's nightmare. He woke to find Tank still stationed on the street below their apartment, the massive biker sitting on his motorcycle, with the patient stillness of someone who'd done guard duty before and understood its importance. The sight should have brought relief, but instead it crystallized a question Caleb hadn't wanted to ask: if they needed protection. Who exactly were they being protected from? Rachel had barely slept, her face drawn and pale. As she made breakfast, neither of them could eat. The phone had rung 6 more times during the night, each call the same heavy breathing, then silence, then disconnection. She'd stopped answering after the third one, but the persistent ringing had been its own form of torture, a reminder that someone out there wanted them to know they were being watched. The news coverage had started before dawn. Rachel discovered it when she couldn't sleep and turned on the television, keeping the volume low so as not to wake Caleb. But he'd been awake too, staring at his ceiling and replaying yesterday's events in an endless loop. Local stations led with the story, sheriff arrested for evidence tampering. By 7, the state networks had picked it up. By 9, CNN was running segments about small-town corruption exposed by a child witness. The video Betty Walsh had recorded went viral with speed that felt surreal. Within 24 hours, it had accumulated 2 million views across various social media platforms. Strangers from across the country were commenting on Caleb's courage, sharing the story, making him into something larger than himself. But those same platforms also hosted darker commentary people defending Sheriff Cross, questioning Caleb's motives, suggesting an 8-year-old couldn't possibly understand what he'd witnessed. By noon, reporters had found their address. Rachel looked out the window to see 3 news vans parked on their street, camera crews setting up equipment, producers making phone calls. The hardware store below had its own media contingent, Mr. Harrison standing at the door with his arms crossed, refusing to let anyone upstairs. His loyalty to Rachel was absolute, but Caleb could see the strain on his employer's face, the recognition that this attention was disrupting business and might not fade quickly. Marcus arrived with groceries before Rachel could even think about going to the store. He brought milk and bread and sandwich fixings, practical supplies that suggested he understood single mothers living paycheck to paycheck couldn't afford to take unpaid time off work. Club takes care of its own. Your family now. Rachel's response mixed gratitude with concern. We can't accept charity. We don't want to be in debt. Marcus's interruption was gentle but firm. This isn't debt. You don't owe us anything. We owe Caleb everything. That boy saved 12 lives yesterday. Least we can do is make sure he and his mama eat this week. The phone calls continued throughout Sunday, some from reporters requesting interviews, others from concerned neighbors, a few from people whose voices Rachel didn't recognize but whose intentions were clearly hostile. By evening, she'd unplugged the landline entirely, the constant ringing having become unbearable. Detective Klein called on her cell phone around 6, her voice carrying professional concern. We're investigating the threatening calls. Phone company is cooperating with traces, but these people aren't amateurs. They're using burner phones calling from different locations. Klein continued with information that made Rachel's stomach drop. I need to prepare you for what's coming. Cross's arrest is going to trigger review of every case he ever worked. We're talking potentially hundreds of arrests, dozens of convictions. Some of those people are going to want new trials. Some will be exonerated. This isn't just about 12 bikers anymore. This is institutional corruption on a scale that's going to take months, maybe years to fully unpack. Monday morning brought the challenge Rachel had been dreading. Caleb had to return to school. She'd considered keeping him home, but Mr. Harrison had been understanding about her taking Sunday off and couldn't afford to lose both weekend days plus Monday. They needed her income. Bills didn't stop accumulating just because your child had exposed corruption that was now dominating news cycles. Tommy Pierce met them at the school entrance, his presence a small anchor of normalcy in a day that felt anything but normal. The boy's loyalty shone through his greeting. Dude, you're famous. It's crazy. But famous felt more like target than celebration to Caleb, who just wanted to disappear into the background where he'd spent his entire life before Saturday. Mrs. Morrison, his third-grade teacher, tried to maintain normalcy as students filed into the classroom. She was in her late 20s kind, but overwhelmed by the sudden media attention her class had received. Caleb is here to learn, just like everyone else. What happened this weekend was extraordinary, but he's still just a student who deserves privacy and respect. Her words didn't stunt the stares, the whispers, the pointing. Some kids looked at him with awe, others with suspicion. Many with simple curiosity about someone who'd become a news story rather than just their quiet classmate. Caleb kept his head down, focusing on arranging pencils in his desk with intensity, usually reserved for defusing bombs. Recess brought the confrontation he'd been anticipating. A group of older kids, 5th and 6th graders, who'd never paid attention to him before, surrounded him near the basketball court. The ringleader was a boy named Derek, whose father worked construction and apparently had strong opinions about Sheriff Cross. My dad says you helped criminals, says Sheriff Cross was arresting bad guys, and now they're going free because of you. Says you're a traitor to this town. The shove that followed wasn't hard enough to hurt, but was clearly meant to intimidate. Caleb stumbled backward, his anxiety spiking into panic territory, vision tunneling, as his brain screamed warnings about violence he'd witnessed just 2 days ago. Before things could escalate, Mia Pierce appeared like an avenging angel. Tommy's 13-year-old sister had a reputation for not tolerating bullies, and she inserted herself between Caleb and Derek with authority that made the older boy hesitate. Back off. He did what was right. If you can't see that you're as corrupt as Cross was. The confrontation dissolved, but damage had been done. Caleb spent lunch period in the library, unable to face the cafeteria where he knew conversations would stop when he entered. Tommy sat with him in supportive silence, not pushing for talk, but just being present in ways that friendship required. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Elena Cruz, a social worker in her mid-20s who worked with the school district, pulled Caleb aside during art class with permission from Mrs. Morrison. They sat in an empty conference room and Elena's eyes were red-rimmed but determined. "I don't want to burden you with this, but I need you to know what your testimony might mean for my family. My cousin Gabriel, he's in Florence prison. Been there 4 years. Sheriff Cross arrested him for drug possession when Gabriel was 25. She paused, composing herself. He swore he was innocent, said the drugs were planted during a traffic stop, but the jury saw a Hispanic man with tattoos and a prior record from when he was 17, and they convicted him in less than an hour. His daughter was 2 when he went in. She's 6 now. She doesn't really know her father except through prison visits." Elena's voice broke. "What you witnessed, what you testified to it might save him, might give him back years that were stolen. I just wanted to say thank you. You're braver than anyone I've ever met." After she left, Caleb sat alone in the conference room for 10 minutes before returning to class, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility he'd never asked for. Gabriel Santos had lost 4 years of his daughter's life because Caleb hadn't known to speak up sooner. The logic was irrational. He understood that on some level, but guilt didn't require rationality to be crushing. Tuesday brought the formal announcement from the state attorney general's office. Detective Klein held a press conference that Caleb watched on the television in the school's administrative office, having been called down by the principal who thought he should see this. Klein stood behind a podium with the state seal flanked by FBI agents whose presence suggested federal involvement. "We are announcing a comprehensive review of all cases handled by Sheriff Daniel Cross during his 28-year career in law enforcement. This review will encompass 247 cases ranging from minor drug possession to major felony charges. We have a reason to believe that evidence tampering may have occurred in a significant portion of these cases." She continued, her voice carrying the weight of institutional failure. "A special investigative unit has been formed combining state police resources with FBI oversight. We will be reaching out to individuals convicted in Cross's cases to offer them opportunity for review and potential appeal. This process will take time, but we are committed to ensuring that justice is served even when that means acknowledging the failures of a system that should have caught this corruption years ago." The press conference triggered immediate reaction across Redstone. That evening, the high school auditorium hosted an emergency town hall meeting that drew over 500 residents. The room was packed beyond capacity, people standing in aisles and doorways, the air thick with tension that felt ready to ignite at any provocation. The crowd divided itself along predictable lines. On one side sat families of those convicted by Cross people like Elena Cruz, who carried hope mixed with rage that justice had taken so long. They demanded accountability, compensation, and acknowledgement that the system had failed them catastrophically. On the other side sat Cross's supporters, citizens who'd known him for decades and couldn't reconcile the respected sheriff with the corrupt criminal now sitting in jail. They argued that releasing convicted criminals was dangerous, that one child's testimony shouldn't undermine years of law enforcement work. Marcus attempted to speak, but the hostility from Cross's supporters was immediate and vocal. "You don't belong here. This is our town, not yours." Someone else shouted accusations about motorcycle clubs corrupting youth, bringing drugs and violence to peaceful communities. The irony of accusing them of drug crimes while defending a sheriff who'd planted drugs wasn't lost on Marcus. But irony didn't penetrate ideology that had calcified over 15 years. Rachel surprised everyone by standing, her voice shaking but determined. "My son is 8 years old. He witnessed a crime and reported it. That's what we teach children to do. If that's controversial in this town, then our values are broken." The applause that followed came primarily from one section of the auditorium, while the other sat in hostile silence that spoke volumes about divisions that wouldn't heal quickly. Wednesday morning brought the breakthrough that would redefine the investigation's scope. Detective Klein had obtained a warrant to search Sheriff Cross's home, an office standard procedure in corruption cases. In his home office, hidden behind a false panel in his desk that took forensic investigators 2 hours to locate, They discovered a leather-bound notebook containing meticulous records that read like a confession. Klein called Marcus to the sheriff's station to view the evidence, and she requested that Caleb be present with Rachel's permission. When they arrived, Klein's expression carried the weight of someone who'd seen corruption before, but never documented with such chilling precision. "You need to see this. Both of you." The notebook contained 43 entries, spanning 12 years each, documenting a case where Cross had planted evidence. The entries were clinical, detached, written in handwriting that suggested the author saw nothing wrong with what he was doing. Started small. Martinez case suspect actually guilty, but evidence inadmissible due to illegal search. Ensured justice through alternative means. Result: conviction, appropriated sentence served. The entries escalated over time, showing a progression from justifying evidence planting in cases where guilt was certain to creating cases against people Cross simply didn't want in Redstone. Immigrants, minorities, anyone he deemed undesirable for his vision of the community. The notebook referenced people by name, dates of arrests, sources of planted evidence, outcomes of trials. It was systematic, methodical, the work of someone who'd convinced himself that breaking laws was justified if it served a greater purpose. But the most disturbing discovery came in the final entries written just 3 weeks before the Iron Forge frame-up. Cross referenced something he called the committee in ways that suggested he wasn't operating alone. Committee meeting June 1st. Present, Adabu, JHMT discussion. Iron Forge removal approved as priority. All agreed that presence of MC undermines community standards. Authorization given for full operation. The initials appear repeatedly throughout the latter entries. RW, JHMT, along with Cross's own DC. 4 people working in concert to control who stayed and who left Redstone, operating above the law they were supposedly enforcing. Klein's face was grim as she explained implications. "This goes beyond one corrupt sheriff. We're looking at organized conspiracy at multiple levels of town leadership. Identifying these individuals is now our top priority." Caleb stared at the notebook, feeling sick. The scope of corruption was so much larger than he had imagined. Sheriff Cross hadn't been a lone actor, but part of a coordinated effort involving people who were still free, still in positions of power, still capable of protecting themselves by eliminating threats. And the primary threat was an 8-year-old boy who could testify about what he'd witnessed. The protection detail around Caleb intensified after Klein's revelation. Iron Forge implemented rotating watches, ensuring at least 2 members were always visible near the apartment. But visibility only protected against direct confrontation, not the subtler threats that began manifesting. Thursday at school during afternoon recess, a man approached Caleb while he was sitting alone on a bench reading. The man wore a visitor badge and carried a professional camera. "Hey there, I'm a reporter doing a story about brave kids. Just want to ask you a few questions." Something in the man's approach felt wrong to Caleb. Reporters had been everywhere since Saturday, but school policy required them to check in with the office and coordinate interviews through parents. This man had bypassed those protocols, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, just walk with me to my car. We'll do a quick interview and I'll give you $50. The hand that reached for Caleb's arm was intercepted by Smoke, who'd been assigned as inconspicuous school security. The biker moved with speed that belied his size, positioning himself between the man and Caleb. "Back away from the kid, now." The stranger's demeanor changed instantly, professional facade dropping to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. He fled toward the parking lot before school security could respond, disappearing into a gray sedan that peeled out with squealing tires. License plate traced back to a rental car registered under a false name, paid for with a credit card that investigators would later determine belonged to a shell company with no legitimate business operations. Detective Klein's assessment was blunt when she briefed Rachel that evening. That wasn't a reporter. That was attempted kidnapping. Whoever's behind this, they're escalating. Simple threats didn't work, so now they're trying direct action. Rachel's breaking point arrived like a dam bursting. "We can't live like this. Maybe we should leave town, start over somewhere they can't find us." Her voice carried desperation that came from realizing her child was in danger she couldn't protect him from through normal parental means. Marcus's response was pragmatic but offered no easy comfort. "Running won't help. They found you here, they'll find you anywhere. Driver's licenses, school records, employment history, all leave trails. Better to stay where you have protection while Klein builds her case. Leaving means being isolated, vulnerable, easier targets. Caleb overheard this conversation from his bedroom, and guilt that had been building since Saturday crashed over him with crushing force. His mother was terrified because he'd spoken up. Their lives had been upended, their safety compromised, their normalcy destroyed. The weight felt unbearable for shoulders that hadn't finished growing yet. Friday morning brought news that shifted public opinion in ways Cross's supporters couldn't easily dismiss. The state court held an emergency hearing for Gabriel Santos, whose case had been specifically mentioned in Cross's notebook with damning clarity. Santos arrest clean, but subject's profile suggests future criminal behavior. Planted evidence ensures preventative incarceration. Community protection prioritized over individual rights. The hearing took less than an hour. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd served on the bench for 20 years, read the notebook entry aloud in a voice that shook with barely controlled anger. This is not law enforcement. This is tyranny disguised as protection. Mr. Santos's conviction is overturned immediately, and he is ordered released from custody within the hour. Gabriel walked out of Florence prison that afternoon after 4 years of wrongful imprisonment. News cameras captured the reunion with his daughter, a 6-year-old named Maria, who'd been 2 when her father disappeared into the system. The child was shy at first, uncertain of this stranger claiming to be her daddy. But Gabriel was patient, gentle, and eventually she climbed into his arms with tentative trust that would take time to fully restore. Elena brought her family to the hardware store that evening to thank Caleb personally. Gabriel stood in the small apartment, looking impossibly thin, his eyes carrying shadows that 4 years in prison had carved deep. I don't have words big enough for what you did. You gave me back my daughter. You gave me back my life. Maria, clutching her father's hand with fierce determination, offered Caleb a drawing she'd made crayon rendering of stick figures labeled Daddy, Me, and Hero Boy. The simplicity of childhood art couldn't capture the complexity of what had transpired, but gratitude needed no sophisticated expression. But relief at one exoneration was tempered by understanding that Gabriel's case was just the first. Over the next week, 3 more convictions were overturned based on Cross's notebook entries. Rodriguez family members who'd been in prison for 2 years, Henderson case where a 10-year sentence was vacated, Williams case where 15 years of someone's life was stolen by a sheriff who decided guilt based on appearance rather than evidence. Each release was celebrated by families who'd lost loved ones to corruption, but Cross's supporters grew more vocal with each exoneration. The argument that criminals were walking free gained traction among people who couldn't accept that their respected sheriff had been systematically destroying innocent lives. Protests downtown turned heated, nearly violent, requiring police intervention to separate groups that seemed ready to tear each other apart. Through all of this, Caleb spiraled deeper into anxiety that his mother and Marcus could see, but didn't know how to address. He'd stopped eating more than a few bites at meals. Sleep came in fits interrupted by nightmares that had him waking in cold sweats. School had become torture each day, bringing new confrontations, or simply the exhausting effort of existing under constant scrutiny. Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the confrontation at Canyon's Edge, Caleb woke from another nightmare to sounds that didn't belong in pre-dawn darkness. Glass breaking, male voices speaking in urgent whispers, footsteps on stairs that led to their apartment. Rachel bolted awake in her room across the hall, and Caleb heard her grab her phone, dialing what he knew was Detective Klein's emergency number. Tank and Diesel were on watch rotation outside, and what followed happened with speed that would later seem impossible to reconstruct. The intruders were 3 men masked, armed with suppressed handguns that suggested professional training. They bypassed the building's basic alarm system with ease that indicated inside knowledge of its flaws. They moved toward the stairwell with clear intention, and their whispered communication revealed mission parameters. Just the kid, leave the mother if possible, make it look like accident. Tank heard the glass break and radioed for backup immediately, but response time, even with motorcycles racing through empty streets, would be 6 minutes minimum. He and Diesel engaged the intruders at the base of the stairwell, their large frames creating physical barrier between threats and their objective. Tank's voice carried authority earned through military service. This is private property. Leave now or we call police. The lead intruder's response was matter-of-fact, professional. We're not here for you. Just the kid. Walk away and nobody gets hurt. That confirmation that Caleb was the target transformed the situation from potential misunderstanding to active threat. Diesel drew his legal concealed carry weapon, and Tank positioned himself to block stairwell access entirely. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds before the lead intruder made his decision and fired. The suppressed gunshot sounded like someone clapping absurdly quiet for something that tore through Tank's shoulder and spun him sideways. Diesel's return fire was unsuppressed, the report echoing through the industrial district like thunder. Intruders realized immediately that they'd miscalculated, that two bikers with military backgrounds weren't going to yield just because someone had guns. Backup motorcycles arrived with sirens that were technically illegal but served their purpose, and the intruders retreated through the broken window rather than risk capture. Police arrived 8 minutes after initial call, finding Tank bleeding but conscious, Diesel unharmed but shaking with adrenaline, and Rachel barricaded in Caleb's room with her son, both of them traumatized but physically safe. Shell casings collected from the scene were professional ammunition untraceable through normal channels. The intruders left no identification, no evidence beyond the violence they'd attempted. Detective Klein arrived within an hour despite the early morning call, and her assessment was grimmer than anything she'd offered before. These were professional contractors, not local criminals. Hired muscle brought in from outside. Someone with serious resources wants that boy gone, and they're not being subtle about it anymore. Rachel's voice when she finally spoke was hollow, defeated. We're leaving, tonight. This is insane. He's 8 years old and people with guns just tried to kidnap or kill him. We're leaving Redstone, leaving Arizona, going somewhere. They can't find us. Klein's response was honest, but offered no comfort. Leaving won't help. They found you here, they'll find you anywhere. License plates, employment records, school, enrollment, all leave digital trails. You're safer here with protection than isolated somewhere trying to hide. But I understand if you can't accept that anymore. Marcus made the decision that would define the next phase. You move into the clubhouse. Secure facility, always people present, better security than apartment above hardware store. Until Klein identifies who's behind this and we can address the threat directly, you need fortress, not apartment. The clubhouse in Redstone's industrial district had been Iron Forge's home for 15 years, a converted warehouse with reinforced doors, security cameras, and the constant presence of members who treated protection as sacred duty. By Sunday afternoon, Caleb and Rachel had moved their essential belongings into a private room that had been hastily prepared, and their new reality settled in with weight that felt permanent. Living in the clubhouse meant constant noise, constant activity, constant presence of people who intimidated Rachel, even as they protected her. But it also meant safety that the apartment couldn't provide, and when faced with choosing between comfort and survival, the choice was obvious. Monday brought the revelation that would expand the investigation beyond anything Klein had anticipated. Following the money trail from shell companies that had paid the intruder's rental car deposit, forensic accountants discovered patterns that all traced back to a single law firm, Weber and Associates, a respected practice that had served Redstone's business community for 30 years. Senior partner James Weber was 62, a pillar of Redstone society who'd served on city council, school board, and various civic organizations. Cross-referencing his initials with the committee references in Cross's notebook produced exact match JW mentioned repeatedly in context suggesting leadership rather than subordinate role. Weber wasn't just aware of Cross's corruption, he appeared to be orchestrating it. Klein's briefing to Marcus and the senior Iron Forge members was delivered in the clubhouse's main room, away from where Caleb might overhear. We're not dealing with one corrupt sheriff. We're dealing with organized criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of town government. Weber's firm has represented nearly every significant business in Redstone. He has access, connections, resources. And based on phone records we're now subpoenaing, he's been in regular contact with the Cross for years. The implications cascaded through Marcus's mind with terrible clarity. So the attempts on Caleb, the professional contractors, that's Weber protecting himself. Klein nodded. Weber and whoever else is part of this committee. We've identified initials, but not all names yet. Working theory is that we're looking at mayor, police chief, possibly others. They've been controlling Redstone through systematic elimination of anyone who didn't fit their vision of community. Cross was their enforcer, but when he got arrested, they had to protect themselves through other means. She paused, her expression showing the strain of investigating people with power and connections, which makes Caleb the primary witness to a conspiracy that reaches the top of town leadership, and they know it. Thursday brought escalation that demonstrated how desperate the committee had become. Detective Klein received a package at her home delivered by untraceable courier service. Inside were photographs of her family, her husband, her two daughters aged 10 and 13. The girls were photographed leaving school, walking home, playing in their backyard. Each photo was marked with red X, and the accompanying note carried message too clear to misinterpret: back off or your kids learn what consequences mean. Klein reported the threat immediately, but the message had landed. She had family to protect, career to consider, and the conspiracy she was investigating had demonstrated willingness to target children. That she continued the investigation despite personal risk spoke to integrity that Cross had clearly lacked, but the threat changed her calculations about timeline and methods. Friday morning brought the development that would transform investigation into murder case. Captain Roy Webb, Cross's immediate supervisor for the past 8 years, and one of the people whose initials appeared in the notebook as RW, was found dead in his home. Initial assessment appeared to be suicide, single gunshot to the head service weapon in his hand. Note that read, "Can't live with what I've done. Cross's crimes are on me, too." But Klein's examination of the scene revealed inconsistencies that suicide couldn't explain. Webb was left-handed, but the gun was in his right hand. The angle of the gunshot wound suggested someone standing rather than sitting. Most damningly, the suicide note was written on paper that didn't match anything else in Webb's home, and handwriting analysis would later reveal it wasn't his writing at all. Webb had been scheduled to give formal statement to investigators that afternoon, testimony that would have identified other committee members and detailed their operations. His death hours before that testimony was timed with precision that couldn't be coincidental. The committee was eliminating loose ends, cleaning house, erasing everyone who might testify against them. Klein's briefing Friday evening carried weight of someone recognizing that the stakes had escalated beyond corruption into territory where murder was considered acceptable cost of protection. Webb's death was staged to look like suicide, but it's murder, which means the committee is willing to kill to protect themselves. They've already tried once with Caleb. They've threatened my family. They eliminated Webb. This is no longer just a corruption case. This is organized crime operating at highest levels of local government. That evening, Caleb overheard the conversation he wasn't meant to hear. Marcus, Diesel, and Klein were discussing Webb's death in the clubhouse office, voices low, but carrying through thin walls to where Caleb sat pretending to do homework. He heard Klein say Webb was mentioned in Cross's notebook, was going to testify about committee operations. Someone decided he was liability. He heard Marcus respond, "So they'll view anyone who can testify as liability, including 8-year-old boy who started all this." The realization crashed over Caleb with devastating force. People were dying because of what he'd exposed. Webb was dead, murdered to silence testimony about conspiracy Caleb had inadvertently revealed. His testimony made him threat to people with resources and ruthlessness to eliminate threats permanently. He found Marcus alone later, his voice small but determined. "I'll say I made it up. I'll recant my testimony. Tell them I was confused, mistaken, whatever they need to hear. Just make it stop, please." Marcus's response was gentle but uncompromising. "Can't put truth back in bottle once it's out. Webb's death isn't on you, it's on people who decided covering their crimes was worth murder. If you recant, they win, and everything you've endured was for nothing." But Caleb was breaking under pressure. No child should have to carry, "I'm 8, I just want to go home. Want to go to school without guards. Want to watch nature documentaries and build models with Tommy. I don't want to be brave anymore." Marcus held him while he cried, and there were no easy words to make this better. No promises that could undo what had been set in motion. Saturday morning brought the final blow that would shatter Caleb's fragile composure completely. A package arrived at the clubhouse addressed specifically to him, intercepted by security, who opened it carefully in case it contained explosive device. Instead, they found something more psychologically devastating, a DVD and a note. The note was typed professional: "Stop interfering or watch what happens to those you love." The DVD contained surveillance footage showing Rachel at Morrison's grocery, Tommy walking home from school, Marcus working in his motorcycle shop. Each person Caleb cared about was shown in crosshairs, marked for death, if he continued cooperating with investigators. Caleb watched the DVD before Marcus could stop him, and the sight of crosshairs centered on his mother's head destroyed the last of his ability to cope. He didn't cry or scream or show outward emotion. Instead, he simply shut down his brain's protective mechanism, activating to save him from trauma it couldn't process. He stopped speaking, stopped responding to questions, stopped engaging with the world in any meaningful way. Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma specialist Marcus brought in, examined Caleb and delivered assessment that confirmed everyone's worst fears. Acute trauma response, emotional shutdown. He's carrying weight no child should carry, and his brain is protecting him the only way it knows how. He needs immediate intervention, but more importantly, the threat needs to be eliminated. Living in constant terror is destroying him. If this continues much longer, the damage may be permanent. As Saturday afternoon faded into evening, Caleb sat in his room at the clubhouse, staring at nothing, the leather bracelet Marcus had given him tight around his wrist. Outside, the committee was still operating, still threatening, still willing to kill to protect themselves. Inside, an 8-year-old boy who'd only wanted to do the right thing was breaking under pressure that grown men with weapons and training would have struggled to endure. Rachel sat beside her son, holding his hand, feeling him present physically, but absent in every other way. Marcus stood in the doorway watching the child, who'd saved his brothers, disappear into himself and made a decision that would either end this nightmare or escalate it beyond anyone's ability to control. The committee had made their position clear. They would kill anyone who threatened their power. That meant the only way to protect Caleb was to eliminate the threat at its source, and Marcus knew exactly how to make that happen. Part 2 complete when word count 6502 words. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the clubhouse within an hour of Marcus's emergency call, her professional demeanor masking concern that showed only in the tight set of her shoulders. She spent 40 minutes alone with Caleb, trying various techniques to reach the boy, who stared through her rather than at her, present in body but absent in every meaningful way. When she emerged from the room, her assessment carried urgency that demanded immediate action rather than gradual therapeutic intervention. Her voice was measured but uncompromising as she addressed Marcus and Rachel in the clubhouse office. What I'm seeing is acute dissociative response to overwhelming trauma. Caleb's brain has essentially shut down non-essential functions to protect itself from stimuli it can't process. He feels responsible for Webb's death, for threats against everyone he loves, for consequences that cascade beyond his ability to comprehend or control. An 8-year-old's cognitive framework isn't equipped to handle warfare psychology, and that's effectively what you've subjected him to. Rachel's face crumpled guilt, adding to fear that had been her constant companion for 2 weeks. What do we do? How do we fix this? Chen's response offered no easy comfort. Short-term medication might help stabilize mood and reduce anxiety. Long-term extensive therapy, but honestly, neither will be truly effective until the external threat is eliminated. You can't heal someone who's still actively under attack. Either you resolve this situation or you accept that Caleb will carry permanent psychological damage from trauma that should never have been his burden to bear. Marcus made his decision with the kind of clarity that came from years of military training where hesitation meant death. We end it now. No more waiting for Klein's investigation to slowly build a case while the committee picks off witnesses and terrorizes children. We force their hand publicly, make them expose themselves, finish this before it finishes him. Klein arrived within the hour, summoned by Marcus's cryptic phone call that suggested she'd want to hear his plan before attempting to stop it. She listened to his proposal with the expression of someone recognizing that legal procedures had been outpaced by circumstances requiring more aggressive intervention. What you're describing is vigilante justice. I can't officially sanction it. Marcus's response was pragmatic. Not asking for sanction, asking you to be ready when we force them into the open. Have your FBI contacts positioned. Have arrest warrants prepared. We'll provide the stage and the audience. You provide the legal conclusion. The plan came together with speed born of desperation. Sunday morning, downtown square. Iron Forge would gather publicly, making presence impossible to ignore. They would confront the committee members by name, force them to respond in front of witnesses and cameras. Klein's investigation had identified the four remaining conspirators through phone records, financial trails, and Webb's preliminary testimony before his murder. James Weber attorney Martin Thompson, mayor, Robert Harrison, city council member, and Mr. Harrison's estranged older brother, and police chief Patrick O'Brien. Deputy Martinez, who'd been living with crushing guilt since his role in the frame-up attempt, agreed to wear a wire. Over the previous 3 days, he'd received multiple calls from Weber, attempting to secure his silence through threats against his family. Those conversations would be recorded legal in Arizona's one-party consent state and would provide evidence of ongoing conspiracy and witness tampering. Saturday evening, Marcus explained the plan to Caleb in terms simple enough for a traumatized 8-year-old to grasp. Tomorrow we finish this. The bad people who've been hurting everyone, we're going to make them face what they've done. You don't have to do anything except watch. Let us handle it. Then it's over and you can start being a kid again. Caleb's response was barely audible, his first words in nearly 24 hours. Promise. Marcus couldn't promise outcomes he couldn't control, but he could promise effort. I promise we'll do everything in our power to end this tomorrow. One way or another, you won't be living in fear anymore. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear desert air, carrying the kind of chill that would burn off by noon, but felt sharp at 6 a.m. Marcus woke the clubhouse with efficiency that suggested military background, organizing 52 motorcycles into formation that would make their presence undeniable. Iron Forge's 12 core members led the group, but allied clubs from across Arizona had answered the call for support. Devil's Advocates sent 15 members. Road Saints sent 12. Smaller independent clubs contributed singles and pairs. The message was clear: threaten one motorcycle club and you threaten the entire community. By 7 a.m., they'd assembled in Redstone's town square, parking in concentric circles around the gazebo with military precision. Engines cut simultaneously, leaving silence that felt louder than the rumble that had preceded it. People woke to find their downtown transformed bikers standing beside their machines with arms crossed, waiting with patient determination for confrontation they knew was coming. Word spread through Redstone with viral speed. By 7:30, several hundred citizens had gathered, some hostile, many curious, all understanding that something significant was about to unfold. Local media arrived first, then regional stations, who'd been following the corruption story, then national crews who recognized that this confrontation represented culmination of narrative that had captured public attention. Marcus stood in the gazebo with a microphone someone had brought, his voice carrying across the square, with authority earned through leading men into situations where leadership meant survival. Citizens of Redstone were here for truth. 15 years ago, we came to this town seeking home. Instead, we found prejudice, harassment, systematic targeting. But we stayed because this is our country too. We served it, we love it, we deserve to live here freely. The crowd swelled as he spoke, several hundred, becoming nearly 1,000, the entire town seemingly pulled toward this moment by gravitational force of truth that had been suppressed too long. Marcus continued his words, measured but carrying emotion he wasn't trying to hide. 4 days ago, 8-year-old boy named Caleb Rivers witnessed crime. Sheriff Cross planting drugs on our motorcycles. Caleb was brave enough to speak up, and since then he's been threatened, attacked, hunted like an animal. His mother terrorized, his childhood destroyed, all because he told truth about powerful men breaking laws they were supposed to enforce. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the divided nature of Redstone's response to recent events reflected in reactions ranging from supportive to skeptical. Marcus pressed forward. We're here today because truth deserves light and because Caleb deserves justice. Not just for him, but for every person Cross and his allies destroyed. For Gabriel Santos, imprisoned 4 years for crime he didn't commit. For the Rodriguez family, torn apart by false charges. For Captain Webb, murdered because he was going to testify about conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of this town's government. That last statement sent shockwaves through the gathering. Webb's death had been reported as suicide, and Marcus's public assertion of murder forced acknowledgement of implications many had been avoiding. Mayor Thompson arrived within minutes, face flushed with anger that could have been genuine or performed. This is a legal assembly. Disperse immediately or face arrest. Marcus's smile was cold, calculated. Mayor Thompson, excellent. We were hoping you'd come. Need to ask you some questions. Publicly, about your role in Sheriff Cross's conspiracy. Attorney James Weber arrived moments later with Robert Harrison, both men wearing expressions that mixed outrage with poorly concealed panic. Weber's voice carried practiced authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. My clients will not be subjected to harassment. This gathering is unlawful, and you will disperse immediately. Detective Klein stepped forward from where she'd been standing in plain clothes among the crowd, her badge now visible. Martin Thompson, James Weber, Robert Harrison. You're all under federal investigation for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and racketeering. We have Sheriff Cross's notebook documenting your involvement. We have financial records linking you to illegal operations. We have testimony from multiple victims. Weber's composure cracked slightly, but his legal training reasserted itself. You have allegations, hearsay, no proof that would survive scrutiny. Cross was a rogue officer. Any suggestion that respected community leaders conspired with him is absurd and actionable. Marcus revealed the trap they'd set with timing calculated for maximum impact. Actually, we have recordings. Deputy Martinez has been wearing a wire for 3 days. Since you, Mr. Weber, called him Wednesday night and threatened his family if he cooperated with investigators. That's witness tampering, federal felony caught on tape. Martinez stepped forward from the crowd, pulling the wire from beneath his shirt with hands that shook but showed determination. That guilt had finally transformed into courage. They tried to buy my silence. Threatened my mother, my sisters. I've recorded everything. Every call, every threat, every admission. He handed the recording device to Klein, and Weber's carefully constructed facade shattered completely. The attorney's face cycled through expressions too quickly to catalog, settling on desperate calculation. This is entrapment, illegal surveillance. Nothing recorded will be admissible. Klein's response was delivered with satisfaction of someone who'd built an airtight case. One-party consent, state, all legal. And you've made very specific statements about Cross's operations, about committee decisions, about targeting individuals you deemed undesirable. It's all documented now. Mayor Thompson attempted to flee his political instincts, recognizing that staying meant being arrested on camera. But Diesel moved to block his path with physical presence that was imposing without being violent. Stay and face what you've done, but own it. The crowd's energy shifted perceptibly, more people now recognizing that the bikers weren't the threat, but rather the ones forcing accountability from leaders who'd operated above scrutiny for years. Phones recorded from every angle, live streams broadcasting to audiences that would grow into millions as news spread. Then Police Chief Patrick O'Brien arrived with 5 uniformed officers, and the atmosphere transformed from tense confrontation to something that felt capable of erupting into violence. O'Brien was armed, his hand resting on his service weapon, with casualness that suggested willingness to use it. His officers flanked him with similar readiness, and the message was clear: cooperation wasn't being offered. His voice carried authority that came from 30 years in law enforcement. This ends now. Everyone disperses or arrests begin, all of you. Well, the threat was directed at the bikers, but Klein stepped between O'Brien and Marcus with her own badge raised and federal authority that superseded local jurisdiction. Her voice remained calm but carried steel underneath. Chief, we have warrants for your arrest too. You're part of this conspiracy. Stand down. O'Brien's response was to draw his weapon, the movement smooth and practiced, but undertaken with desperation of someone who'd run out of options. Not if you're dead. None of this matters if witnesses don't survive to testify. The crowd gasped collectively, civilians scattering, creating space around the confrontation that had suddenly become potentially lethal. 50 bikers faced 6 armed police officers in standoff that felt like it could erupt into massacre. Caleb, watching from Marcus's truck parked at the square's edge with Rachel holding him, felt terror spike through the dissociative fog that had protected him for days. Then Rachel Rivers did something that would define her forever in Redstone's history. She stepped into the space between armed men with her hands raised unarmed, her voice carrying across the square with maternal fury that transcended fear. Enough, Chief O'Brien. I'm Rachel Rivers, Caleb's mother. Your conspiracy already destroyed my son's childhood, turned him from happy 8-year-old into traumatized witness who can't sleep, can't eat, can't function. You going to kill me too? in front of 300 witnesses while cameras are rolling, because if you do, you prove everything we're saying is true. O'Brien wavered, his weapon still raised, but his grip loosening as he processed implications of shooting an unarmed mother in front of crowd that included children reporters and hundreds of recording devices. The calculus was impossible. Shooting meant life imprisonment and national infamy. Surrendering meant the same imprisonment, but without the added weight of cold-blooded murder. The sound of additional sirens resolved his dilemma. FBI vehicles arrived in coordinated formation, 10 federal agents in tactical gear, with rifles raised in authority that couldn't be disputed. Special Agent Thomas Crawford's voice boomed across the square with finality. Robert O'Brien, Martin Thompson, James Weber, Robert Harrison, you're all under arrest. Federal warrants have been issued. Drop weapons and comply immediately. O'Brien's weapon clattered to the pavement. His officers followed suit, recognizing that resistance meant death and cooperation meant potential legal defense. The 4 committee members were handcuffed in Redstone's town square as morning sun climbed higher, and citizens watched justice finally arrive after years of being delayed by people who believed power made them untouchable. 3 weeks later, federal courthouse in Phoenix hosted grand jury proceedings that would determine whether charges against the committee members would proceed to trial. The evidence was overwhelming: Cross's notebook, financial records, recorded conversations, Webb's preliminary testimony preserved before his murder, and most critically, eyewitness testimony from the child who'd started everything. Caleb had spent those 3 weeks in intensive therapy with Dr. Chen, working through trauma that had nearly destroyed him. Medication helped stabilize his mood. Regular sessions addressed PTSD symptoms that manifested in nightmares and panic attacks. But what helped most was knowing the immediate threat had been eliminated. The committee was in federal custody. The assassination attempts had stopped. He could begin processing what had happened without simultaneously fearing what would happen next. The courthouse felt impossibly large to Caleb as he entered, with Rachel and Marcus flanking him like guards. Marble floors and high ceilings created echo chamber where every sound magnified. Security screening felt invasive but necessary. The grand jury room itself was smaller than he'd imagined, just 23 citizens seated in tiered rows and attorneys at tables facing them. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Mitchell, who'd built her career on public corruption cases. She approached Caleb with gentleness that suggested she understood what testifying would cost him. Just tell them what you saw and heard. Truth is all we need. Nobody's going to hurt you here. Her questions were straightforward, designed to establish facts without traumatizing the witness further. Caleb, can you tell us what you witnessed on June 22nd behind Morrison's hardware? Caleb's voice started quiet but grew stronger as he spoke the words he'd been carrying for weeks. Finally released, I heard Sheriff Cross and Deputy Martinez talking. They had bags, evidence bags with drugs inside. Sheriff said Iron Forge was cancer and it was time for surgery. He said he'd been cleaning up the town his way for years. He talked about planting the drugs under motorcycles so the bikers would be arrested. The grand jurors listened with expressions ranging from shock to anger to sadness. These were ordinary citizens confronting evidence that their town's leadership had been systematically corrupt, and the cognitive dissonance was visible on their faces. Defense attorney attempted cross-examination that felt more like attack. You're 8 years old. How can you be certain what you heard? Might you have misunderstood adult conversation about complex law enforcement matters? Caleb's response was simple, direct. I know what I heard. He said plant the drugs. He said make sure they're all arrested. I'm 8, not stupid. I understood exactly what he meant. The attorney pressed harder. You've been living with Iron Forge MC. They've provided housing security support. Isn't it possible they've influenced your testimony, coached you to say things that support their narrative? Something in the implication that he was being manipulated sparked anger that cut through Caleb's anxiety. They protected me because the committee tried to kill me. 3 men with guns broke into my apartment. They said they were there for me. Iron Forge stopped them. That's not influence, that's survival. And I'm testifying because Gabriel Santos lost 4 years with his daughter. Because 16 other people are in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Because Sheriff Cross told me I should have kept my mouth shut and I won't. Not when telling truth can help people. The prosecutor's redirect was brief. Caleb, are you afraid right now? He nodded. Yes, I'm terrified. Then why testify? The question forced Caleb to articulate something he'd been feeling but hadn't put into words. Because being scared of doing the right thing is worse than doing it anyway. Because if I stay quiet now after everything that's happened, then all the fear and the threats and the nightmares were for nothing. At least this way, maybe something good comes from it. The gallery erupted in applause that the judge allowed briefly before restoring order. Gabriel Santos sat in the front row with his daughter both crying. Elena Cruz mouthed "thank you" with expression of gratitude that transcended words. Other exonerated prisoners and their families filled the bench as witnesses to the child who'd given them back their lives. The grand jury deliberated for 45 minutes before returning indictments on all charges against all four defendants. The foreman's announcement carried weight of community, finally acknowledging its failures. We find sufficient evidence to indict James Weber, Martin Thompson, Robert Harrison, and Patrick O'Brien on all counts: conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice evidence, tampering witness intimidation, and accessory to murder in the death of Captain Roy Webb. We recommend they be held without bail pending trial. Outside the courthouse, media surrounded Caleb and his family, but Marcus created physical barrier that allowed them space. Caleb delivered brief statement that had been prepared with Dr. Chen's guidance. "I just want to go home and be 8 years old again. Thank you to everyone who believed truth mattered more than power. Thank you to Iron Forge for protecting me when nobody else could." That's all. The simplicity carried more impact than elaborate speech could have achieved. National news that evening featured the clip repeatedly, an 8-year-old asking for normalcy that adults' corruption had stolen. Public opinion, which had been divided throughout the ordeal, shifted decisively towards support for Caleb and recognition that systemic change was necessary. 1 month after the grand jury, Caleb returned to school with accommodations that Dr. Chen had helped arrange. He would attend regular classes but had access to counselor's office when anxiety became overwhelming. Teachers were briefed on trauma responses and given strategies for supporting him. Most importantly, security measures ensured that he wouldn't face harassment from students whose families still supported the committee. The school environment had changed in subtle but significant ways. Some kids still avoided him, uncomfortable with his notoriety. Others treated him like celebrity in ways that felt exploitative rather than genuine. But a core group led by Tommy and Sophia Coleman Wrench's daughter provided friendship that asked nothing except his presence. They played at recess, worked on group projects, shared lunch in companionable silence, when talking felt like too much effort. Sophia's understanding of what Caleb had experienced came from her own family's struggles with prejudice. Wrench's Apache heritage had made him target of discrimination throughout his life, and Sophia had inherited that burden. Her empathy created bonds stronger than typical childhood friendship. "My dad says you're the bravest person he knows, but I think brave people still get scared. They just don't let fear stop them." Community transformation proceeded unevenly, resisted by some who couldn't accept that their trusted leaders had been criminals. Approximately 30% of Redstone's population continued defending the committee, arguing that even if methods were flawed, intentions had been good. They believed Cross had protected the town from genuine threats and that releasing convicted criminals endangered everyone. But 70%, swayed by evidence and moved by Caleb's courage, demanded accountability and change. The town elected a new mayor on reform platform. A new police chief was hired from outside, someone with no connections to the previous administration. City council underwent significant turnover as members compromised by association with the committee, either resigned or were voted out. Iron Forge's status in Redstone shifted dramatically. The motorcycle club that had been pariahs for 15 years suddenly found themselves welcomed in businesses that had previously watched them with suspicion. Their charity work, which had always existed but been ignored, was now celebrated. Annual toy drive for underprivileged children raised 3 times previous amounts. Motorcycle safety courses expanded to serve regional community. The clubhouse hosted community meetings addressing ongoing reconciliation efforts. But acceptance wasn't universal. Vandalism still occurred occasionally, derogatory graffiti targeting the MC. Some businesses still refused service. Parents still warned children to avoid bikers, prejudice being more resilient than evidence. Change was happening, but slowly and perfectly, reminding everyone that transforming hearts required more than exposing corruption. Caleb's healing progressed in fits and starts. Good days when he could focus on schoolwork and laugh with friends. Bad days when panic attacks made breathing difficult and flashbacks transported him back to moments of terror. Dr. Chen continued weekly therapy sessions, gradually reducing frequency as coping mechanisms strengthened. Medication was adjusted to manage anxiety without dulling the emotional processing necessary for genuine recovery. 6 months after the grand jury, Redstone held a town hall meeting to announce creation of a scholarship fund for students who'd experienced discrimination or injustice. The fund had been seeded by Iron Forge with $50,000, with an additional $100,000 raised through community donations. It would provide educational support from elementary through college, ensuring that victims of prejudice had resources to build better futures. The naming debate was settled by Caleb himself. Many wanted to call it the Caleb Rivers Courage Scholarship, but he proposed an alternative that honored everyone affected, the Second Look Scholarship. For people who didn't get fair first look, for everyone who gets judged before they're known. Marcus spoke at the announcement ceremony with eloquence that surprised those who still saw bikers as intellectually limited. Caleb taught us that appearances deceive, that prejudice blinds justice, that courage sometimes means standing alone against the crowd. This scholarship honors not just him, but everyone who suffered because they looked different, spoke different, believed different than those in power. It's acknowledgement that we failed as community and commitment to doing better. The first recipients included Gabriel Santos, whose college education had been interrupted by wrongful imprisonment, Sophia Coleman, recognizing the discrimination her family had faced, 3 children of exonerated prisoners, 2 minority students facing ongoing bias. Each recipient represented a second chance, an acknowledgement that the system owed them better than what they'd received. 1 year after the confrontation at Canyon's Edge Diner, federal trials concluded for all 4 committee members. The proceedings had been lengthy, complicated by legal maneuvering and attempts to suppress evidence. But prosecutorial case was overwhelming, built on documentation that Cross had meticulously maintained and testimony from dozens of victims whose lives had been destroyed by conspiracy operating in plain sight. James Weber received 18 years for his role as the architect of the committee's operations. Martin Thompson received 15 years for abuse of power and civil rights violations. Robert Harrison, whose involvement had been less extensive, received 12 years. Patrick O'Brien, facing additional charges for attempting to draw his weapon on civilians and FBI agents, received 20 years. All appeals were exhausted within months, the evidence being too comprehensive to challenge successfully. Cross himself, having pleaded guilty to 43 counts, was serving 25 years in federal prison. He would be 77 upon release, his career and reputation destroyed by choices he justified as protecting his community. The anniversary brought memorial service at Town Square, honoring victims of the committee's corruption. Speeches were delivered by exonerated prisoners, by family members who'd lost years with incarcerated loved ones, by community leaders acknowledging institutional failures. But the most powerful moment came when 9-year-old Caleb took the microphone with confidence that therapy and time had restored. His voice carried across the crowd without the trembling that had characterized his earlier public statements. "Year ago, I was most scared I'd ever been. Not of Sheriff Cross or the committee, but of what speaking up would cost me. It cost a lot. My childhood, my peace, my feeling safe, but silence would have cost more. Would have cost other people their freedom. Would have cost me knowing I did what was right when it mattered." He paused, making eye contact with faces he now recognized. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a kid who witnessed crime and reported it. That's what we're supposed to do, what we teach kids to do. If that's controversial, our values need examining. I'm grateful to Iron Forge for protecting me, to my mom, for never giving up, to everyone who believed truth mattered more than comfort. That's what we should all aspire to, choosing truth even when lies are easier." The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, and in that moment, Redstone demonstrated how far it had traveled from the town that had enabled corruption through willful ignorance. Not everyone had changed, but enough had that the trajectory was clear. Truth had won, imperfectly, inexpensively, but definitively. After the ceremony, Marcus and Caleb stood at the overlook outside town, where they'd had difficult conversations during the darkest days. The desert stretched before them, vast and beautiful and indifferent to human drama that seemed so consuming to those experiencing it. Marcus handed Caleb a gift he'd been working on for months, a model motorcycle, intricately detailed, perfect in its craftsmanship. His voice carried emotion he didn't bother hiding. Made it myself. Took 6 months. Wanted you to have something that represents journey. You helped me rebuild my faith in people, in courage, in justice. Not the easy kind that comes without cost, but the kind worth fighting for. Caleb examined the motorcycle with appreciation for skill required to create something so precise. Can I ask you something? Would you do it again? Knowing what it came to, Marcus's response came without hesitation. Every time, some costs are worth paying. Your courage saved innocent people, changed this town's trajectory, exposed corruption that would have destroyed more families. That's legacy worth any price. The question Caleb had been carrying finally found voice. Do you think it's really over, that we're safe now? Marcus provided honest answer rather than comfortable lie. Committee is finished. Cross and his allies are in prison. But bigger questions about prejudice, about justice, about courage, those never end. Each generation faces them again. Your job now is heal. Be 9 years old. Let adults handle next battles. Rachel joined them, her arms sliding around her son's shoulders with protective gesture that had become instinctive. He's right, you've done enough, more than enough. Time to be kid again. 3 years later, Caleb stood at 11 years old, having grown 3 inches and gained confidence that therapy and stability had fostered. He was active in the Second Look Scholarship Program, mentoring younger kids who'd experienced discrimination. His academic performance placed him in advanced classes. Friendships had deepened with Tommy, Sophia, and others who saw him as person rather than symbol. The nightmares had faded to occasional occurrence rather than nightly torment, and panic attacks happened rarely enough that he could manage them with techniques Dr. Chen had taught. Marcus had become more than mentor, evolving into something that resembled the father Caleb had never known. They spent Saturdays working on motorcycles, Marcus teaching mechanical skills, while imparting lessons about honor, integrity, choosing right over easy. The relationship benefited both Marcus processing loss of his wife by nurturing someone who needed guidance, Caleb gaining male role model who demonstrated that strength included vulnerability and that protecting others was highest calling. The Iron Forge MC had solidified its place in Redstone as community pillar rather than threat. Membership had grown by 15 over 3 years, young men drawn to brotherhood that valued honor over profit. The clubhouse hosted community events, served as gathering place for support groups, functioned as resource for families navigating difficult circumstances. Annual charity ride raised $500,000 for local causes, demonstrating that the patches people had feared represented commitment to service rather than criminality. Gabriel Santos had completed his college degree and was working as youth counselor, helping teenagers avoid mistakes that had characterized his own adolescence. His relationship with his daughter Maria had strengthened through years of consistent presence after imprisonment's forced absence. They visited Caleb occasionally, gratitude manifesting in friendship that transcended the trauma that had brought them together. The Second Look Scholarship had been replicated in 8 other Arizona towns where similar corruption had been exposed. The model spread through advocacy networks, demonstrating that Redstone's experience, while specific in details, reflected broader patterns of prejudice and abuse of power that required systematic addressing. Caleb's story was studied in criminal justice and ethics courses, example of how single act of courage could catalyze institutional change. On a Saturday morning 3 months before Caleb's 12th birthday, he rode passenger on Marcus's Harley for the first time since everything had changed. The fear he'd carried about motorcycles, about bikers, about all the assumptions his life had disproven, had finally dissipated enough that he could experience the freedom that Marcus had tried to explain but couldn't truly convey through words alone. Wind pulled at his hair as they rode through desert landscape, where sky met earth at horizons that seemed infinite. Behind them rode 12 motorcycles in formation. Iron Forge brothers who'd become family through bonds, forged in crisis but sustained through genuine affection. The rumble of engines wasn't threatening anymore, but rather comforting reminder that he wasn't alone, that community meant showing up for each other when circumstances demanded courage. They stopped at the overlook where difficult conversations had happened during darkest days, and Marcus killed the engine to let silence settle around them. The view hadn't changed, but everything else had. Caleb was no longer the terrified 8-year-old who'd witnessed corruption and nearly been destroyed by speaking truth. He was becoming someone stronger, more resilient, carrying scars, but not defined by them. Marcus's voice broke the silence with question that had been on both their minds. You doing okay? Really, Caleb considered before answering, honesty requiring more than reflexive reassurance. Most days, yeah. Still have bad days when everything feels too heavy. Still get scared sometimes when I remember how close things came to going wrong. But mostly I'm okay. Better than I was. He touched the leather bracelet that had become permanent fixture on his wrist. People ask if I'd do it again, knowing panic attacks and nightmares and fear that still wakes me sometimes, knowing how it changed everything. Answer is yes, because Gabriel got 4 more years with Maria, because 34 innocent people are free, because Redstone learned that truth matters more than comfort. That's worth the cost. Marcus pulled him into a brief hug that conveyed pride and affection and recognition that this child had accomplished something most adults would never manage. You grew up too fast. I wish I could have protected you from that, but you're going to be okay. Better than okay. You're going to do remarkable things because you understand something fundamental that many never learn. Courage is an absence of fear. It's knowing fear might destroy you and choosing to act anyway. As the sun climbed higher and other club members joined them at the Overlook conversation, shifting to lighter topics about upcoming charity ride and debate about where to get lunch, Caleb felt something settle inside him that had been restless for 3 years. Peace wasn't complete, healing wasn't finished, but trajectory was clear. He would carry what had happened forever, but it wouldn't carry him. The weight had become manageable, integrated into identity that was larger than trauma and stronger than fear. That evening, back at the apartment above Morrison's Hardware, where they'd returned after security concerns had finally eased, Rachel made his favorite dinner, while Caleb did homework at the kitchen table. Normal domestic scene that would have been unremarkable before everything changed, but felt precious now, precisely because it was ordinary. Tommy called to make plans for tomorrow conversation about video games and soccer, reflecting friendship that had survived when others hadn't. Marcus stopped by briefly to drop off parts for the model car they were building together, staying for coffee and conversation that ranged across topics, having nothing to do with corruption or courage or any of the heavy subjects that had dominated their relationship's early days. He was just Marcus now, the man who had shown Caleb that found family could be as strong as blood ties. That protection wasn't obligation but choice, that showing up consistently mattered more than dramatic gestures. As Caleb prepared for bed, the leather bracelet placed carefully on his nightstand, beside the model motorcycle Marcus had made, he reflected on journey that had transformed him from invisible kid to national news story to finally just Caleb again. The attention had faded as news stories captured public interest. Reporters had moved on. Most people who'd known his name 6 months ago had forgotten it already. That anonymity felt like gift rather than loss. He could walk through Redstone without being recognized by strangers, could attend school without constant awareness of being watched, could exist in spaces without his presence changing the atmosphere. The paradox of his experience was that fighting to be seen had ultimately allowed him to choose invisibility again, but this time as choice rather than necessity. His final thought before sleep claimed him was about the Second Look Scholarship recipient he'd met that afternoon, a 10-year-old girl whose family had been targeted by different corruption in different town, but whose story echoed patterns Caleb recognized. He'd told her what Marcus had told him. You're brave not because you were not scared, but because you did what was right anyway. That's all any of us can do. And you're not alone. You'll never be alone again. The leather bracelet sat on his nightstand, catching moonlight reminder of Marcus's wife, who'd believed in standing up despite fear of Danny, who'd died protecting his friend, of everyone who'd demonstrated that courage was practice rather than trait. And Caleb understood finally that he'd become part of that legacy, another link in chain of people who chose truth over comfort, who paid costs that seemed unbearable but turned out to be survivable, who proved that doing right wasn't about being fearless, but about acting anyway. In darkness of his room and apartment above hardware store in small Arizona town that had learned painful lessons about justice and prejudice, 8-year-old who'd witnessed corruption and nearly been destroyed by speaking up had become 11-year-old who understood that healing was possible, that trauma didn't define you unless you let it, that family was whoever showed up when you needed them most. The nightmares would still come occasionally. The anxiety would flare in moments of stress. The memories would never fully fade. But Caleb Rivers had learned something that would serve him for the rest of his life. Courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about choosing right action despite fear that might crush you. And in that choosing again and again, you built a life worth living and a legacy worth leaving. The Second Look Scholarship would outlive him, helping generations of kids who'd been judged unfairly, giving them chances they deserved, but the system had denied. The committee members would serve their sentences, their corruption exposed, and their power broken. The Iron Forge MC would continue protecting their community, no longer as outcasts, but as brothers who'd proven their worth when it mattered most. And Redstone would carry forward the lessons learned through crisis imperfectly, but honestly understanding that justice required vigilance and that truth was always worth the cost of speaking it. In the end, one child's witness had shattered a town's comfortable lies and forced confrontation with ugliness that had been thriving in darkness. The cost had been enormous, but so had the benefit: 34 innocent people, freed systematic, corruption-exposed community, forced to examine its own complicity. And somewhere in that calculation of cost versus benefit, there was answer to the question that would follow Caleb forever. Was speaking up worth what it cost? His answer would always be yes, because silence would have cost more, and courage meant paying the price that truth demanded, even when that price felt impossible to bear.